Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Carol Looper. I'm a member of CMC's Board of Trustees, and I used to be a reporter, and I sometimes still think I'm a reporter. Good to see you all today. Today's forum, John Dean, The Legacy of Watergate, is a Chief Justice Thomas J. Moyer Legacy Forum with additional support from Event Marketing Strategies. Please help me thank them. And now please welcome Steve Stover of the Moyer Legacy Committee to introduce our forum. Steve?
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to the Columbus Metropolitan Club for inviting the Chief Justice Thomas J. Moyer Legacy Committee of the Ohio State Bar Association to sponsor this event. As a member of the Metropolitan Club and as the chair of the Chief Justice Moyer Legacy Committee, I'm honored that this is the site of the first and third Chief Justice Moyer Lecture Series events. And here we are within view of the building that bears his name. You can see out the back, actually, it's a white building in the back. The Moyer Committee was, we're delighted, before I say that, we're delighted to have 8 members of the Chief Justice Moyer Legacy Committee here today at the front table, along with our very special guest, Mary Moyer. Many of you knew Tom Moyer, a great Chief Justice, a leader, a facilitator, and a mentor. The Chief Justice Moyer Legacy Committee was formed in 2010 to provide a lasting memorial to Chief Justice Moyer's dedication to the administration of justice and the public understanding of the law, including legal and civic education, dispute resolution, ethics, civility, judicial independence, and the rule of law, which are more important today than ever. The Moyer Committee has accomplished much in 9 years, including establishing the Chief Justice Moyer Professorship for the Administration of Justice at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, creating the Moyer Fellowship Program to provide research opportunities for students at Ohio's 9 law schools, hosting a 2013 event featuring retired U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, a great friend of the chief, who delivered an address on civic education and civility, founding the Ohio Civility Consortium, a statewide collaboration of groups supporting civility and public discourse, and establishing this Chief Justice Moyer Lecture Series to present high-quality lectures featuring noteworthy speakers of the day, including our first event last year with the Congressional Civility Caucus, founded by Columbus members of Congress Steve Stivers and Joyce Beatty, with whom we are collaborating for more programs across the state now. John Dean, an Ohio native, became a household name in the 1970s as the White House counsel for President Nixon during the Watergate era. John has been in the news a lot this year as a commentator on CNN, apparently sometimes with John Kasich, and a witness before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee on the implications of the Mueller report, which we might hear about today. Jim Robinault is a noted historian in his own right, with 3 books to his credit, and is a partner at the Thompson-Heim law firm in Cleveland. He collaborates with John Dean to present educational programs across the country. Today's program will combine living history and an important perspective on current events. Please welcome John Dean and Jim Robinault.
Thanks, Steve. Well, it's very nice to be here. I'm Jim Robinault. I grew up in Lima, Ohio, so not all that far from Columbus, and I went to The Ohio State University College of Law and graduated in 1981. So I get to moderate this with John, and my first question to you is, what's it like to be John Dean?
I think the most fundamental answer is I get to be married to Maureen Dean
There you go.
for 50 years. You know, it's been great. It's been interesting. It's sometimes surprising. I get recognized, particularly now that I'm back on CNN. I have a high profile again, and people come up and they say interesting things. Maybe the most interesting of late is a guy was sizing me up at LAX and finally got the courage to come up and speak. And what he said and the way he said it is very memorable to me. He said, "Didn't you used to be Dick Cheney?" You know, I just wish the movie Vice was out at that time. I would have said, "No, I'm Christian Bales."
All right, so John and I got together in 2004 when Dick Cheney and John Edwards debated up at Case, Western Reserve. I was asked to put on a seminar about Ohio and its presidents. John had recently written the book on Warren Harding, and great nephew George Harding and his wife Joan are here today, so if you could give them a round of applause. So I asked John to come. As I say, he had written this book for Arthur Schlesinger, another Buckeye, about Warren Harding. And it has a new look at Warren Harding, and it's a revision of the history.
It's actually the actual story.
It's the actual story. And so I asked John to come up, and he came up to Cleveland, and we met. And I said to him, I said, "John, you're not going to believe this, but the Western Reserve Historical Society has the love letters that President Harding wrote to a mistress named Carrie Phillips during the rise of Harding to senator and then to the presidency. And you got to come and take a look at these." And so we scrolled through them, 900 pages of letters. Turns out, I did an investigation. She was being followed as a potential German spy during the First World War. So the story ends up being a broad story, but like John, I came to the conclusion that Warren Harding was a very good president and did great things for this country. And we don't have enough time to talk about that today, but both of us agreed on that. That started our collaboration. I wrote a book called The Harding Affair, Love and Espionage During the Great War. And then in 2000...
I was in the middle of my last book called The Nixon Defense. And I thought it was a book I could do very quickly by reaching in and getting a couple of Nixon's untranscribed, secretly recorded conversations. His defense had been that he didn't know anything about Watergate until I told him on March 21st there was a cancer on his presidency. While I hadn't had a lot of dealings with him, I knew enough to know the way the place worked that was not correct. So I started this process of going through all the tapes, found no one had ever cataloged them. That took 6 months just alone, found there were about 1,000 Watergate conversations. And so I hired a team of transcribers. And while they were, I found it was easier to correct a transcript than do one from scratch. And so I had this wonderful team. It was led by a legal secretary who was getting her PhD in archival science. And she drove the other students. I don't know what I would have done without her. And it turned out I ended up with 4 million words of transcript, which I had to bring down then to a reasonable sized book of roughly 150,000 words. It's while working on that I'm talking to Jim, and I'm saying, you know, I teach, or I'm invited to speak at lawyers' continuing legal education programs all the time. I said, they don't have a clue what to do with Watergate. I've got all these tapes now. Why don't we take some of those conversations, go out and talk to lawyers, tell them about the mistakes that I made as a young lawyer and many other lawyers made. In fact, the entire redesign of the American Bar Association's Code of Professional Ethics came right out of my testimony. And I said, I think we could put together a really interesting program. That was in
Beginning of 2010 into 2011. Our first program was in June in Chicago of 2011. And I casually said, sure, I'll be happy to do a program with you, not knowing that he would then send me all these books and I'd have to listen to all these tapes and get really immersed in all of this. And guess what? Our very first program was about obstruction of justice by a president of the United States. This was before Donald Trump was on the scene. So we did our very first program about the so-called smoking gun tape where Nixon tells the CIA to turn off the FBI investigation. And so we jumped really deeply into obstruction of justice. And then we had no idea. The reaction was the best thing I've ever been to, loved it. And we all of a sudden got invitation after invitation.
We've never had a sales or marketing operation. To make a long
Except
story
me.
short, occasionally, yes. I don't like to sell, and Jim can handle it when necessary. But we've done somewhere over 150 programs. We've talked to between maybe 45 and 50,000 lawyers over the last few years. That's what we were doing this morning. We could do a lot more of them, but both of us have real jobs.
Yeah.
So it's kept us busy. It's been fun, and we've developed a great friendship out of it.
It's been great fun. And for example, on the 40th anniversary of Watergate, the Washington Post held a special commemoration of the Watergate break-in at the Watergate. And so John invited me to come. And he told me, and I believed him, that he had never been in that building before. But in any event, we went, and there was Ben Bradley, Woodward, Bernstein,
I see some young faces who have no clue who Ben Bradley was. He was the editor of the Washington Post during Watergate.
Right.
Woodward and Bernstein were the cub reporters who ran with the story when nobody else in the country was.
And that night, we went to a very special private dinner at Ben Bradley's house in Georgetown. And if you know his story, he lived there for a long time and was good friends with John Kennedy and their Georgetown friends and so forth. So we were in that wonderful home. And the last thing that I witnessed was...
He also noticed your wife.
Yeah, he knows my wife.
Who happens to be, was for years a journalist at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, just recently retired.
Yep, she's a great writer. And the last thing I saw, though, that night was, and by the way, Bill Weld was there that night. You know who he is, running for president now? He's somehow married into that family. I forget what it was.
Yeah.
But so he's there. Last thing I see is Woodward and Bernstein going over and kissing Bradley on the head as they left. I mean, it was really touching. I mean, it was really quite a moment. You just think, wow, all this history in this little thing. So one of the things we do, can you play this? This is what we do for our audiences. Play this little segment of tape so you can hear.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
All right, so if you heard in the middle of that, this is Nixon, of all places at Disney World. Seriously, making this, and that I'm not a crook, you all know that saying. He's down there defending what's happened. John had testified in June of that year, and this is November of that year, so he's down there defending himself. But the obstruction of, I've never obstructed justice. Well, John had been in to see him on March 21, 1973, and outlined all the ways they had obstructed justice. It's on tape. He knows he had obstructed justice. So we use things like that to get our audience into it with real live, video, audio, and including these tapes where John goes in. So let's start with that, because I then want to talk about Don Magan and Donald Trump. Don Magan is was the White House counsel, same position that John held.
You don't have the March 21st?
No.
No.
So let's take you to that moment, March 21st, 1973. John is, now think about this, 34 years old. And he walks in to tell the leader of the Western world that there is a cancer growing on his presidency, and if he doesn't stop it, it's going to kill him. So maybe you could describe that moment.
Yeah, the night before, Nixon had called me in a fairly routine call, and I had broken protocol. One of the rules of the game in the Nixon White House, where you had a very strong chief of staff, who's today the model of all, excuse me, chiefs of staff, you didn't go into the president without going through his office. But Nixon was talking to me, and I had reached a point where I realized this presidency couldn't last going the way it was. There truly was a cancer growing on this presidency, and I thought the president ought to be told that without my superiors around me, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, who filtered everything that I had to say about anything. So he had by then started to develop a personal relationship with me. He'd said some very nice things about me in his diary. He was delighted to be working with me. And so I said, this is the time. So when he called on the night of the 20th, I said, Mr. President, I need to meet with you. And he said, can you do it at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? I said, yes. I had hoped to give some thought to preparing what I was going to say, but never had time for it. And that next morning went in, and to get his attention, told him just those words, that there was a cancer on his presidency. And I, with that, had his full attention, because sometimes I would go in, his feet would be on the desk, and he'd look around his shoes at me to pursue the conversation, whatever was going on. But anyway, I took him through every single instance of where what was going on at the White House was trouble. I said, you know, Bud Krogh, who worked in one of the units of the White House that had hired the guys who later broke in the Watergate. I said, you know, when Bud went before the Senate to get confirmed as Undersecretary of Transportation, he's confessed he's committed perjury. And Nixon's reaction kind of caught me off guard. He said, well, John, perjury is a tough rap to prove. What's the problem there? And I, anyway, started marching down this road, and at one point told him the men who'd been arrested wanted $120,000, the lead guy. He wanted $50,000 for living expenses and $70,000 for attorney's fees. And I said, you know, Mr. President, this can just go on indefinitely and forever, and no telling how much it will cost. So at that point, he stopped me and he said, well, John, how much could it cost? And I pulled a figure out of thin air that I thought would offend him. And I said, well, Mr. President, it might cost $1 million. And I was somewhat dumbfounded by his response when he said, John, that's no problem. I know where we can get $1 million. I now know today, after transcribing all the tapes of the events I wasn't present, that he, after I leave, he calls his secretary, Rosemary Woods, into the office. She's another Buckeye, and asked Rosemary, in essence, how much do we have in our slush fund? And she says about $600,000. And I know then following the tapes later, 2 weeks later, he's selling ambassadorships. So this is the morning I went in to try to convince the president to end the cover-up. It's an hour and 50-minute meeting. And I realized by the end of the conversation that I have not carried the day. I have not persuaded him that there's any real serious problem, that he wants to carry on pretty much as we were. And I didn't know who Richard Nixon was, but I, this morning, met him and realized he wasn't who I thought he was. Because any rational person, having your lawyer tell him, for example, I ended the conversation by saying, Mr. President, people are going to go to jail. And he said, like who? I said, like me. And he said, his answer was, oh no, John, the lawyers never go to jail. and I said, well, Mr. President, he said, on what? I said, well, it's the obstruction of justice. We are all involved in that. And he really didn't want to hear too much more detail, because I'd put him in an impossible situation. When the White House counsel tells you he's concerned he's going to jail, the president really has a problem.
By the way, he doesn't know he's being taped. And this whole conversation is taped, and it becomes a centerpiece for all of this. But after that meeting, John decides eventually he can't write the report that Nixon's asking him to write, which would be a bogus report. He gets his own lawyer, he breaks with the White House, and then you see him testify in June of that year before the Senate committee, and you could not help but see him testify because he was on every network, every channel that you turn to, the beginning of PBS, McNeil Lehrer, all of that comes out of John's testimony. John Lennon and Yoko Ono came to Washington to sit and watch him testify. There are pictures of them.
Jim always mentions that because when he found the picture of them, he said, John, your testimony really was important, wasn't it?
That's true. That's true. So we then, in June of this year, Chairman Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee invited John to come. John was not volunteering for this. They really wanted him to come and talk about the parallels between what was found in the Mueller report, Part 2, the obstruction, not the conspiracy, the Russian conspiracy, but the obstruction acts. And could you come and talk to us about that and the parallels with Watergate? So John went to Washington. I went and sat behind him as he gave his statement. You can go look at it online. You can look at the pieces of it. But what we ended up finding as we were really digging into Mueller is there are remarkable parallels between what happened in Watergate and what the Mueller report says. So, for example, dangling pardons to keep people from fully cooperating. That happened in Watergate, and Mueller reports that he believes that happened with Manafort in his report and others, Flynn and potentially Roger Stone. Things like telling the White House counsel to make a bogus report. Don McGahn was told to fire Mueller, and then a few months later when that became news, Trump asked him to make up a false report that he never did that, and McGahn refused to do that. So very similar to John being asked by Nixon to make up a bogus Dean report. And then trying to control federal investigations, let Flynn go. The so-called smoking gun tape in Watergate is Nixon trying to get the CIA to let this all go and to control that investigation.
The bottom line being, we don't learn from history, we just repeat it with a little different twist.
Yeah. So we're beginning now to talk to lawyers about those parallels so that they can know about it and understand it. How many people have read the Mueller report? A number. If you notice, and those of you who do read it, it's really, the second part, obstruction, is a legal brief. It's hard to understand, even for lawyers who are very versed in obstruction of justice, ultimately about, he's describing the conduct, but does it really fall under all of these definitions of what is obstruction of justice? But we also take it a step further, because Nadler is now not looking just at was there a crime, but are there impeachable offenses? And so we take that a little bit further and look back and say, well, there's only one precedent to look at, it's Watergate. And what did Congress back then think was an impeachable offense? And so we teach that, and we tell our audience to draw their own conclusions.
And that's pretty clear from history. Jerry Ford was the one who really said it. And that was actually before Watergate and the Democrats were addressing the question. It's ironic that Hillary Clinton was on the staff of the committee to determine what was an impeachable offense, along with William Weld, who's now running, the only person right now running against Trump. But anyway, Ford said at the time that he was interested in impeaching William O. Douglas. And he went to the floor of the House, and he'd really gone through a lot of digging and had his staff do it. And he said that impeachment is whatever the House of Representatives says it is. And that's pretty much what it's always been. If a majority of the House says something's impeachable, it's impeachable. The Senate may or may not agree. It takes 2/3 of the Senate to convict and remove. So they have their own judgment on whether that's true or not.
So another thing that we look at, and include in our materials, you can go online and find this. There's a website called Mary Farrell, where you can go get the House report that was done on Watergate, and you'll see what the majority said was an impeachable offense and what the minority said was an impeachable offense. But if you go back and look at the underpinnings of all of it, when the Impeachment Clause was put into the Constitution, what had happened is, as you all know from your history class, we had the Articles of Confederation. that was very weak, just Congress. We really didn't have an executive. You had a president of the United States of the Congress, but not a separate executive. So that was a problem. The government was way too weak, and they get together in Philadelphia and they create the Constitution. And the great debate about the executive and what Article 2 will mean, one of them is, do we include an impeachment clause or not? Because they already know they're going to limit the president to 4-year terms. So they figure that's the way we can cure presidential problems, is that 4-year term. And they all argued further and said, no, we really need an impeachment outlet. But it's got to be carefully defined and limited so that we're not impeaching people for purely political crimes, but really other types of crimes. So they said, what kind of crimes? Well, take a look at it. It starts off as treason and bribery. What were they worried about? They were worried about a chief executive who is under the undue influence of a foreign power. That was their concern back at the time. And so that's why it says treason, bribery, and then they add high crimes and misdemeanors, but they say, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, means within that same grouping of types of crimes, that is, treachery against the state, undermining the state, obstructing justice, doing things like that. These are the things that the founders put in to the impeachment clause when they put it in. So we teach all that, and we let everybody decide what they're going to do. We give them Bill Barr's opinion, and I think the last thing we ought to talk about is just your views on Attorney General Barr and his view of the presidency and what he's expressed.
I love giving talks with you because I don't have to say much. I can just listen.
He's just a smart aleck.
And that's the way it goes in our CLEs too. We know each other too well.
Right.
Too many years. Anyway, what the Barr memo, which was written in June of 2018, and really was an application for a job as Attorney General. People who have any interest in current history ought to dig that document out. It's a little turgid, but to just even scan it. This man was looking for the job of Attorney General. He brings with him a lot of preconceived notions about what that job means and what the presidency, how it should operate. He is a full-throated enthusiast of something called the unitary executive theory. How many here have seen the movie Vice on television? You remember that they actually blocked the words out because Dick Cheney is a fan of the unitary executive theory, and
as was Scalia,
as was Antonin Scalia. And in Vice, I noticed they had David Addington was a character on it, who is one of these legal scholars who's steeped in this theory. And it is the Imperial presidency on steroids and stilts. Let me just give you a couple quick examples. A part of the executive branch is made up of bodies that the Congress, not quite sure what to do, has put in the executive branch, like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FCC to regulate communications. And they're considered executive agencies. The president's about only conspicuous power is the ability to appoint the heads on these. Under the unitary executive theory, these are part and parcel of the executive branch. The president can reach in and tell the SEC what to do or not to do, FCC what to do or not to do, and absolutely redefine how our government works. Bill Barr is of this school. He, for example, thinks that a president can't be charged with a crime unless he's specifically mentioned in the statute. Now, how many statutes do you think have been written where they specifically name the president as a part of the federal criminal code? How about 0? So in other words, the president can't be charged with crimes. You can't even ask the president, when it's a part of his constitutional duty, say to grant a pardon, whether or not he has
corrupt intent.
What is his subjective judgment? Can't ask that under Barr's theory. He could well have been bribed to do it. He would say bribery is a crime, but you can't get that information from the president. So we are living in very interesting times. I thought that the Nixon presidency was fairly aggressive. I came up through the legislative process. I was a committee counsel of the House Judiciary Committee. I think the House and the Congress is a remarkable institution of the American people. While it's pretty divisive right now, still, when you boil it all down, it does speak for us, much more so often than a presidency. Today, the presidency speaks for a very small base of people that Trump thinks can get him reelected. Lord knows what happens if that happens.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for being partisan, but I never had a knot in my stomach during the Nixon years about what Nixon would or wouldn't do. I've not been able to get rid of the knot in my stomach since this man has been elected.
Yeah, I mean, you all remember David Frost in the Frost-Nixon film. It leads to this moment where Nixon says, well, when the president does it, then it is not illegal. And that is kind of the world we're living in right now with the interpretation. So draw your own conclusions, reach your own judgment. You're all citizens. You can read what Barr wrote, and you can read what Mueller wrote, because they're really two conflicting things. Mueller thinks the president can obstruct justice by dangling pardons, and he says so. And he thinks he can obstruct justice by improperly controlling investigations. So read it, take a look at it. That's the great debate that's going on right now. Pay attention to Don Magan, who's been now subpoenaed to appear before the House Judiciary Committee.
Let me tell you what to watch for there. The House Judiciary Committee initially filed an action to get the redactions removed from the Mueller report. There's only one judge who can remove those redactions, and that's the chief judge of the Federal District Court of the District of Columbia. She, what happens to be an Obama appointment, Judge Howell.
Earl Howell. Yeah.
And she had earlier, and within, I'd say, the last year, removed the
seal.
No, she'd removed the restrictions on releasing the so-called roadmap to the, you want to finish? Jesus, he's finishing my words. My wife doesn't even do that. Yeah. Anyway, she had removed the restrictions on the release of the roadmap that was used during Watergate, where the special prosecutors sent the House Judiciary Committee all their findings in front of the grand jury that were key and possibly impeachable offenses. Well, the same judge now is looking at the redactions, and she is the only person that can do that because the chief judge has jurisdiction over the grand jury. Now, what the House has done is they have recently filed a related action, and that is the Don Magan subpoena. Very interesting. Normally when you file an action in federal district court, it goes through a process. It can end up with any of the judges on that court. But they, by going first with the redactions, now have a related case. And this judge is a realist. She's not a partisan, but unlike some judges who are partisans, that's not going to happen here. We'll get a fair ruling on both redactions and on whether Magan is going to testify. It is inconceivable to me that the judge will not enforce the subpoena against Magan. It's inconceivable to me that the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia won't uphold that. They already have said that is existing law. Harriet Mier, who was White House counsel for George Bush, she was asked to appear before the same committee, the House Judiciary Committee, made the same claims. I'm immune, I have, you just can't bring me up here. Dismissed and forced to appear. The Court of Appeals has ruled on that. So these steps are being taken now. There is a very active impeachment inquiry going on. The reason the press is not quite sure what's going on is there's been no vote to have an impeachment inquiry. Well, during Watergate, the committee operated for months before there was a vote when they needed to up the budget. And then they had an impeachment inquiry vote. So hang on, these things take time, and they will be fairly adjudicated.
All right, it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. So when you come up, where do you,
There's a mic.
mic back there. When you come up, please state your name and ask your question. Please avoid editorial comments. And remember, questions end with a question mark. I didn't write this. So let's get started. So state your name and give us a question.
These always take a minute for people to loosen up to get to the mic. You have a question?
Happy to break the ice. Andy Campbell, thanks for being here today, both of you. I'm very curious, the media played a large role in the Watergate scandal. I wonder if you could reflect on how you think the media has changed and how that might be playing a role today with the Trump administration.
Well, in fact, the media played very little role in the Watergate scandal initially. Only one newspaper was covering it, the Washington Post, from roughly June 17 of 1972, when the break-in occurred, until April, somewhat in January of 73, when the burglars were tried. But there wasn't really a full commitment by the media until April of 1973, when Nixon fired his chief of staff, his former White House counsel, his top domestic advisor, yours truly, as well as his attorney general. That got the media's attention. And after that, by then the Senate is gearing up and pretty much covered it throughout the remainder until Nixon departs and thereafter. The big impact on the media, however, has been, this is one of the few lasting impacts of Watergate. It's changed the relationship between the media and the presidency. Pre-Watergate, presidents were given the benefit of the doubt. When Dwight Eisenhower said, that's just a weather plane flying over Russia when a U-2 was spotted, the press didn't question it. When Gary Powers was trotted out as the pilot, really there was no negative reaction to Eisenhower having dissembled on that. Today, it's very different. Presidents post-Watergate are pretty much assumed to be guilty until they establish their innocence. So it's a shifting burden. Other than the other profession that's been affected are the legal profession. It's been deeply affected by Watergate, and it's been a sustained impact. Question?
Go ahead.
I'm glad you're here. Welcome to Columbus, Mr. Dean. I had the great pleasure of being at one of your CLEs, and I'm very glad that you're here as well. Your voice is very important right now. I would like to tell you, I'm Tracy Bretchen. I'm Chief Ethics Officer for the City of Columbus, and I'm very proud to be overseeing a very strict culture of ethics for the city. I'm very proud to work with the City of Columbus. My question to you is, at the base of all of this is really truth and ethical conduct. And I think that it's clear to a lot of people, you're talking about media and culture and so forth in our society now. But what do you think makes good common sense people who are decent, good people have a willingness to believe untruths and be willing to make allowances for unethical behavior when it's so clear? I can tell you from my experience that this is something that troubles me greatly, and I'm glad that you're a voice to speak to this issue. Thank you.
Well, I am pretty blunt and don't hold back, particularly on CNN or in my Twitter account either. And I just think speaking truth to power is important. That if we ever lose that ability and facility, we're in a lot of trouble as a democracy. And while not everybody wants to hear all of that, they can go listen to their own truth, I suppose. I don't believe there are alternative facts and alternative truths. I think that if anything we've learned and become more sophisticated in is in finding what is the truth. There is.
Let me add one point. Why do people sit on the sidelines when it's obvious is a part of that question. And John has been studying authoritarian personalities and leaders since he wrote a book called Conservatives Without Conscience that came out in 2006. He's now revisiting all of that research of authoritarian personalities and why they act the way they act, and writing it with Trump, with the professor who's been studying this his whole life. And at bottom, it's fear. People who are authoritarians are motivated by fear, and that overrides a lot of other things. So, you know, fear of immigration, fear of change, all of that plays into why they then follow authoritarian leaders and don't question them if they think that that person is taking care of the fear that they happen to have. Is that accurate?
Good summary.
Okay. Next.
Hi, my name is David Axelrod. I'm a former assistant United States attorney. I'm one of the 1,000 or so former prosecutors who signed the letter saying that we believe that the president has committed obstruction.
You and 999 additional.
Exactly. I think I was about 230. In any event, I have a very simple question for you. It has two parts. The first part is...
Would you step back just a little bit from the mic? Yeah, we can hear you better.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. The first part is whether you believe that a sitting president can be indicted, and the second part is whether you believe that a sitting president of the United States should be indicted.
The answer is yes to both. Let me cut right to the quick. And let me explain what this policy, as an assistant U.S. attorney, you understand this. There is an office within the Department of Justice called the Office of Legal Counsel. That's considered, and has long been considered, the institutional memory and law firm of the president. When I was White House counsel, I was asked, who do I want to be Assistant Attorney General heading that office? Been headed by some very eminent lawyers, Antonin Scalia, Bill Rehnquist, lots of people. They're good lawyers.
Bill Barr.
Bill Barr, exactly. The reason we have the ruling on this issue occurred in the fall of 1973. Elliot Richardson is the Attorney General, and they have discovered through a Baltimore grand jury that the Vice President, Spiro Agnew, is getting bags with money in the Executive Office building from his days as governor of Maryland. He never cut off the arrangements he'd had as governor, and he's about to be indicted. Agnew goes on a national tour to say, you can't indict me. I can only be impeached. And so this put Richardson, the Attorney General, in a real tough spot because Watergate is also tumbling forward at full speed at the same time. So they got an opinion issued by OLC. And you've got to understand, this is the president's law firm. And like most law firms, when you go to them, you don't get a bad ruling. You get the ruling you want, or they issue something or tell you we shouldn't issue this for whatever reason. So this wasn't just an objective sitting back and trying to sort out what's right and wrong. This is an opinion that they had a real problem. So they had to tell Agnew he was indictable. It's the president who wasn't indictable. And that was a secondary consideration at that time. In 2000, when Bill Clinton is president, he asked for a reissue as to whether that was good law or good policy still. So OLC, not surprisingly, issued an opinion very favorable to the president. Now, there are plenty of opinions out and available. Ron Rotunda, a very able conservative Republican lawyer, actually very helpful to us when we launched our CLEs. Ron, working for Ken Starr, issued an opinion, lengthy opinion, as to why the OLC opinion was wrong. Bottom line, no man is above the law, is where he came out. There are other good opinions. That Archibald Cox's counsel was asked that question very early and determined president can be indicted. So there is no case holding on this. It is purely the policy of the Department of Justice right now.
And by the way, that's why Mueller followed it, because he was within the Department of Justice, and he writes about how he felt he couldn't do anything but follow that policy. It's for others to make that decision. Whether that was right or not, that's the reason.
Yeah, the Southern District of New York, for example, might have come down differently on that. But it's been known as the Sovereign District of New York rather than the Southern District.
Out.
Okay, next.
My name's Eric Brown, and I very much appreciate your being here and appreciate that for the last 45 years or so, you've been out talking about these important issues and educating the public so that we can be better prepared for what we're seeing today.
Hold, just before you can answer, you can ask any question you want after that introduction, but you know, I hadn't planned it this way, and what I am actually working on a memoir that I just call it Watergate at 50, because we're, believe it or not, coming up on the 50th anniversary of Watergate. It's a rolling anniversary, but on June 17th, 2022, is 50 years from the break-in. And it's a rolling anniversary. It will go until August 9 of 2024. So I decided I would write a book that deals with a memoir of a scandal. And why in the hell would somebody stay talking about this thing as long as I have? I've had no choice. I've had no choice because what really forced me out was a group of revisionists concocted a whole new story of Watergate. Took 9 years of litigation because a major publisher got behind it. We prevailed in the long run, and I used the lawsuit to surface documents and material that otherwise never would have been made public. But when they accused my wife of being part of Watergate, they'd crossed the line. And that's when I said, they're not going to get away with this, not as long as I'm an able-bodied person. So that's why I have continued. Otherwise, I probably would have just remained silent. But then I have a real thing about people distorting history. So it's something I have no tolerance for.
Well, thank you, and appreciate your continuing on this effort. I'm a retired judge, former Chief Justice here, as well as now serving on the Columbus School Board. I've also, my wife and I, were neighbors and friends with Jeb Stuart Magruder. And he shared lots of stories from those days with us, along with some political advice. But what really struck me during some of those talks was how young he was at the time, even younger than you were by about three.
No, he was about 3-4 years older.
3-4 years older.
Yeah.
Well, in talking with him, it was his relative youth in those days that we spoke about that made him very unsure about what to do. And I would like your perspective on the same thing. You were fairly young in those days.
Well, about 3 years younger than he was.
Okay, yes. And didn't have a lot of experience to be involved with some of the things you were involved with at that level. How did that impact your decision-making, and what does that tell us for the future?
We've got 1 minute left when we got to stop, so you got to have a brief answer.
I will have a brief answer. You can bring the hook out if I'm over. I never was able to get out of my mind when I saw certain things going on at the White House was maybe I was just too young and too green to understand how it's played in the big leagues. And I constantly asked myself that question. There was really nobody I could turn to ask, so I had to figure it out myself. Historically, I've gone back to look and see if indeed that Nixon was an exception to the rule and not the rule. Nixon, who relied on prior presidents, was always relying on their exceptions. From Lincoln through FDR, he had in his mind, he was a good historian, what presidents could get away with, and he was pushing the limits. You know, I never had anything that came across my desk that I didn't think I could handle in the area of the law. And I was backed up, as I say, by Office of Legal Counsel. But some of the politics I didn't like, wasn't comfortable with, and just went with my own instinct. And when I realized I was on the wrong side of the law, didn't understand it initially, but didn't spend much time there before I decided to convince my colleagues that we were in trouble and we had to reverse course. It wasn't something that sold easily and didn't sell at all in some instances.
Andy Campbell says we can have one more question and a brief
Thank you.
answer.
My name's Jeff Milgram with Event Marketing Strategies, and I'm not an attorney, so I'll be quick.
You're not handicapped.
Andy told me to say that, but no, I just want to know, Mr. Dean, your personal opinion. You guys have both mentioned Don Magan a number of times. What do you think about the fact that as White House counsel, your old job, he has refused to testify, at least till now, voluntarily in front of the House committees where obviously you did. So I just want your personal opinion about his refusal to testify when they've asked him to do so.
Okay,
Thank
we're
you.
on CNN. You got 30 seconds.
I think eventually he will testify. I think he wants it in a circumstance where he has been forced to come forward, that he's under a court order to honor the subpoena. I think he'll be an honest witness. I don't think he will volunteer a lot, but I'm not sure. I don't know how much more he knows. He's well corroborated because he had a chief of staff who either was with him or shortly after kept notes of his activity, Andy Donaldson. So I think he's a very reliable witness in that regard. When I testified in front of the House Judiciary Committee at their kickoff of their hearings on this, I sort of sent a message to McCann. I said, listen, come forward, you have an obligation. Your client is not Donald Trump, it's the office of the president. And in that role, you need to come forward and testify. I said, you won't make new friends. I said, you will make enemies, but your new friends will be good friends.
All right, so point of privilege for me. We're very happy to have been here. I knew Tom Moyer, and I told Mary that he is one of the most revered figures in the state of Ohio in law of all time. So we are really happy to have been here. We have signed books, but John has to speak with the Hardings, and then we've got to get to the airport. But so there are books that are already pre-signed for you to buy. His books, my books, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
I hope you all found today's forum enlightening. And I truly enjoy seeing John Dean on CNN. So if you haven't been tuning in, he's very honest, very upfront, and much like he was today, he tells it like it is, only one version of truth. For the young people who are not familiar with Watergate, the movie All the President's Men is a very interesting look at how the two young cub reporters at the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, broke the story, and then how Watergate came crashing down.
It's got everything but the president's men.
That's very true, but the journalistic approach is fascinating. We've got to thank our sponsors, the Moyer Legacy Committee, Event Marketing Strategies, and our speakers, John Dean and Jim Robinault. And our special thanks to all of you for coming. Hope to see you here next week.